Well, naming names. Let's return then to your own family and your own father, Dennis.
Dennis.
Tell me about him.
Well, Dennis was the third child, and there was. Well, I suppose he was the only, the youngest for about 8 years before Ray. He was born at Farthings. Well, he wasn't born at Farthing. He was brought up at Farthings on Stock Green, and they moved when he was about 2 to the retreat. One of his earliest memory, he told me, was I think it was the R101. His mother held him up at the window, and it was this big balloon lit up, going across the sky, I presume towards London or somewhere, I don't know where. But he remembered that vividly. He remembers walking to school. Sometimes they were given the money to catch the bus, but very often they saved it.
And where was he at school?
At the Catholic school in New London Road, where the Irish nuns would beat you on a Monday because you played truant, on the Friday because you went down the cattle market, as they always did, because they were more interested in farming than they were anything to do with learning. So he got hidings on a regular basis. He reckoned they were pretty vicious. When you think he was only a little boy, from the age of 5, he was walking better part of 3 miles.
There and
back. And that's one of the... and the other thing that he remembers is walking back past the workhouse, the Spike, as they called it.
Oh, right.
In Wood Street, St John's. I don't honestly know.
Right, it would have been... It's quite an imposing building in those days,
yes.
it would have been. So
yes. And there wasn't a lot else around there. It was all fields on the left-hand side. And the men queuing up to get in. I mean, we're talking between the wars. I mean, there must have been a lot of destitute men who'd come back from the war, post-traumatic stress, all that sort of thing. They'd their families perhaps had disappeared, or their marriages had broken up, or they'd become disaffected, whatever. They were lined up by the 100. A dozens perhaps, I don't know how many, but they were lined all the way up there, because you were only allowed to stay one night, and then you had to walk on to the next workhouse. So the next workhouse would have probably been something like, I don't know, Whittam. So you had to walk from Chelmsford to Whittam, and then from Whittam perhaps to Colchester. Colchester had 2, St Albright's and St Mary's had 2 big workhouses in Colchester. But so he remembers the men lined up, waiting to get in.
When was your father born? Do you got a approximate year?
I should know.
I'm just because you'll probably mention ages, and
I know when he was born, but I can't recall it. It's dark. He was, God, 21st of May. It's gone.
Okay.
I'll have to come back to you on that, Ken. That's ridiculous. It's gone out of my head.
It's the obvious things that sometimes one doesn't know. I must confess I couldn't answer the question, so don't feel bad about it. So he's
I thought it was 1922. But I can't...
Okay.
Yes, it was 1922.
It just gives us some idea of roughly when things happened.
Yes, because there's only a year between him and Auntie Kath.
Uh-huh.
And only a year between Auntie Kath and Uncle Henry. So Uncle Henry was born in something like 1919. Kathleen was born somewhere about 1920, 21, and he was born in 1922.
That fits with everything you've
said
so far.
Yes, that's right.
So
it was 1922. Right. I got myself confused. So he basically can't remember growing up in Stock, although they went back there because they've got lots of friends in Stock and there were other relations kicking around. And he was brought up almost solely at the retreat. And, I think he had a good childhood.
When did he leave school?
God. Well, before they left school, they were working anyway.
Right.
I mean, he would cycle down to the railway station and bring the newspapers up to the stores, which is now a house near Castle House.
By the garage.
Between the Wadskit's garage, as it was then, and the Cyclist Rest, or whatever it was called. Which the Roses had when I was a child. So bring them up to the Jepsons. The Jepsons said, and because they had 3 sons, and then they'd sort them all out, and he was brought up. He also shared a paper around with Leslie King, who was my mother's brother. They all knew each other. See, they were brought up. My mother. They all knew each other as children.
So even if they didn't go to the village school, they knew the village children from the rest of
Uncle
the time.
Ray knew his future wife, Dorothy Cockerton, from the time they were in the pram. Because my grandmother would push Uncle Ray about in the pram down Brook Lane and what have you, and she knew Mrs. Cockerton. I think her name was Hope. And Dorothy was in the pram as well, so they met in the pram. They went to separate schools, but they eventually
and then
married.
filled a pram later on.
I got picked up, yes. And the same with my mother. He knew my mother since they were children.
So back to Dennis, and he's
right.
working
So
before he's working.
He used to bring up the papers, and he and my Uncle Leslie, they used to sort them all out, I think, and they'd do separate rounds. They did this before school. We're talking about the crack of dawn here.
I was going to say, time-wise, that's...
and by this time my father must have had a bike, because he used to cycle to school. So they'd do the paper round, and then they would go to school. They used to call my Uncle Leslie Nimble King, because he was anything but, apparently. And everybody had nicknames in those days. They used to call my Uncle Henry Cockerel, because of course hen and cockerel, all this sort of stuff. Anyway, they were in the Scouts together, because the first Galleywood was formed quite early on. And I remember him saying that he and Uncle Les and various other boys in the village, they literally put up that scout hut that used to be on the allotment gardens in Chaplin Close. So, and they'd go away on camps and all that sort of stuff. And anyway, so they'd trog off to school. But my father was apprenticed to a butcher, I think, when he was about 14 or 15.
Right.
I'm not quite sure how old he was then, in Chelmsford, and I'm not sure which butcher it was. Les might be able to remember. But before he was 16, they were all in the TA. The boys were all in the TA. It was like an extension, as far as I could see, of the Scouts. So there was Dick Lilly, all the boys were in the Scouts. Not the Scouts, the TA, because it looked like war was coming.
Where was that based? The TA,
I think it must have been based in Chelmsford.
I'd have thought so.
I've got pictures of them at camps, various places. Well, they're in the Heritage Centre. But there was the Humphreys, there was the Lillies, there was the Tinham, Mr. Tinham, there was Uncle Henry, there was my father. In these pictures, they were all tuning up to go basically to war. I think that it was recognised by the mid-30s, when my father would have been 1930, so he was born in 22, so at 16 it'd be 38. Yep. They were all in the TA.
Right.
And of course, as soon as war broke out, the village disappeared. The men disappeared, and then you've got this rash in the parish records within about a year of war breaking out, or 2 years of war breaking out. All these marriages where the men are listed as being in different parts of the armed forces, different regiments, RAF, whatever, because basically they married quickly to whoever they were intending to marry, perhaps anyway. But my father was only about 16 in 1938. He went and joined the forces. He was underage to go abroad, so by D-Day he was allowed to go abroad, and he went into a tank regiment called the 5 and 4th Yeomanry. So basically the village in 1939 was emptied almost of young men, although there was quite a lot of them in reserve occupations in Crompton's, Hoffman's and Marconi. And people were coming in from other places. So you've got the evacuees like Beatrice and Pat Brotzel,
Mm-hmm.
living down the retreat. They'd come from London. And then you've got people like Mr. Brown, who was drafted into Marconi's, I think, and he married Betty Wright from down Piper's Tie. So you've got men and women coming in, land girls coming in. Some of them went and lived over with Ada Braziers at Rouse House, Rouse Cottage as it was, or Admiral Rouse, whatever you want to call it. So you've got land girls coming in, you've got evacuees coming in, so the nature of the school changed, and you've got incomers marrying Galleywood girls and Galleywood boys. It was a big mix-up after the Second World War. It happened on a lesser scale after the First. Anyway, my dad goes training in places like Northumberland. Apparently he drove tanks over Sutton Hoo as well. Yeah, well, it was a training ground. It was a heath, you know. They were training for D-Day, I suppose.
Yeah.
And so he was in the 5 and 4 for Yeomanry, which is funny really because he was never in an English regiment, although Dick Lilly and a few of them were in the Essex regiment. And he married my mother in 1943 because he could see. He said to me years later, after my mother was dead, that he'd married her by post. He proposed to her by post because by this time her brother had been killed, her father was dead, and they were living very much a hand-to-mouth existence, my mother and her mother. And he thought that if he was killed, at least she'd have a widow's pension.
That's hard, isn't it?
And your mother
Was Daphne King.
and she was living in the village.
She lived in Laurel Cottage in
Mhm.
Stock Road,
Yeah.
between the Eagle pub and the post office.
And the Kings had lived there for many
God,
years. Or...
well, her grandfather had lived in Molsham and then moved to Runnymede Row, which was another line of rural slums in behind the Runnymede pub.
Mm-hmm.
It was a 2 up, 2 down terraces of places with lavatories down the end of the garden, no water supply, you know, the usual sort of thing. But let's deal with Dad first.
Yes, yeah.
So Dad marries my mother. She don't see him, I don't think, for quite a while. The war ends, and he has it in 1945, obviously, but he spends another year in Germany. They were policing.
Yeah, occupation.
Policing Germany, rounded up ex-SS soldiers who got a tattoo under their left arm. I think it was their left arm, with their number on it and their blood group. So, you know, even though they'd taken their uniform off and thrown it away, they could, you know, soon find out who they were. So then he comes back, and by this time, my Uncle Henry is engaged, I suppose, to Joyce Brazier. His mother is ill with cancer of the stomach. He marries my mother in 1943, hadn't he? So, when he comes back after Priest in Germany, I'm obviously conceived and born in 1947. I'm the first child that's been born in the family for a while. Auntie Kath has, in the meantime, married Arthur Baker, and my cousin Michael has been born. And she had 2 sons very quickly, one after another. Michael was the eldest, and then Tony, and then a little gap, and then Melvin and Linda. So they don't see much of her.
She's living away, of course.
Yeah, and of course petrol is still rationed. Rationing didn't finish till 1954.
No.
So anyway, I was born in 1947, and my brother was born in 1949, and just after he was born, no, just before he was born, my father's mother, Nancy, had died in 1949. So the whole of the shape of the family, without my grandmother Nancy at the top, on reflection, it sort of fragmented, because it's the women that send the letters, remember the birthdays. There were no phones. You had there was one telephone.
Sorry.
There was one telephone kiosk up by the school.
Oh, right. No, I'm thinking.
And there was one down. Well, it's still there on Piper's Tie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there was another one.
Mm-hmm.
Not when I can remember. We didn't have a phone until I was 21, which would have been 1968.
And then you saw more than you wanted to know about telephones in your own career.
Oh, yeah, I suppose so, yeah. Mm. So, anyway, they settled down. My father got a job in Marconi's. I see it in certain ways, my childhood. I mean, we were well fed, but the sort of food we ate then, youngsters wouldn't eat now.
In what way?
Well, we had a lot of rabbit for a start. My cousins, the Gisby boys, John and Donald and what have you, they had guns and they were working on the land, and they would bring home rabbits quite often, and we had rabbit. I love rabbit pie. I absolutely love rabbit pie. You go into a butcher's now and ask for a pair of rabbits skinned and jointed, and they think you want them for the dog. I find that appalling, quite frankly. But there you go. I mean, I can skin and gut a rabbit, and I say that to people, and they think, you can draw a chicken. Yeah, well, at Christmas, who the hell do you think's going to draw? They killed them fresh, and they gave them to you fully feathered. And that's the only time you had a chicken. Dad used to, as time went on, what have you, they still did a bit of work to get a bit of money, other than, because you even when the factories closed, we're talking post-war now, if for holidays, you didn't get paid. You didn't have paid holidays.
No, if you weren't there, you weren't paid.
You weren't there, you weren't paid. So Dad would go back. I mean, I remember him working, and they were still using a steam engine, threshing tackle, down at Wood Farm. I remember him helping with my Uncle Ray and my brother and Doug Cotty clear a whole stretch of wood up on the West Hanningfield Park, just by the Bakers Lane area. They halved the wood there and converted it to agricultural land. They used to go to wreath halls at Crondon Hall at Christmas, where they would deal with the turkeys. And they used to wring their necks, I suppose, defeather them. And a woman by the name of Mrs. Mills, I think she used to defeather them as well. And usually they were delivered to you with the head still on and the inside still there. Yeah. So you would draw them yourself. I mean, I've drawn chickens. It's no big deal. If you're going to eat something, at least you knew where it came from.
Yes.
And you could, it wasn't anything like that. But the sort of food we ate was, I suppose, in today's world, would be considered unhealthy. Suet pastry, quite a lot of it, really. You'd make it, and my grandmother would roll it out into a sort of oblong, and she would put, you could get bacon scraps from the co-op or what have you, and they'd boil up an onion, slice it up, boil it up, cool it, mix it with the cooked bacon, lay it in the on this suet crust pastry, roll it up and seal it either end and steam it. It's absolutely delicious, but you won't see people eating it now.
It's probably not on the government's obesity agenda to
well,
to promote
we were
that.
much more active then, because buses were very infrequent. Very often, first thing in the morning, the men going to work, they were full anyway. So, people walked everywhere or cycled everywhere. But I think like most weekends you had a piece of beef, because in those days, for some reason, beef was cheaper than chicken. And the next day, or if it was lamb, you'd had it cold, and then you'd have a stew, and then you had stewed dumplings. So it was different. You did. We had a local baker, so you'd get, treats if you like, donuts or rice buns from them. Fish and chips on Friday. If Mum went to town, she'd bring them back, or she got them from down by the Bear. There was a fish and chip shop, so you could get off the bus there on a Friday, get your fish and chips, and walk up Waterhouse Road and fish and chips. Saturdays, my gran and Mum had got into the habit of going, while my father was away in the fighting, they got into the habit of going to Saturday pictures, and you'd take your meal with you because you saw it round twice. But if they only went for once later on, then in the winter especially, we had herring, which I absolutely love, and winkles, brown bread and butter.
Oh, with the pin?
With a pin.
Yes.
So that was a tea for an afternoon. And we ate a lot of stuff out the garden. My dad was a really good gardener, and he kept 2 allotments. One for potatoes and one for other stuff. So he kept 2 allotments going, plus a big garden. And that's basically... And they lived in Laurel Cottage with my grandmother, which was really very good, because you only got across the stock road and we were on the common as kids. It was just magic.
Who were the neighbours?
We had Billy Smith and Della lived next door. Della was Nee Burrells. Mr. Burrells owned the post office, her father originally, and he was a builder. So the actual property went all the way. It was called Millview, the post office, all the way through to the street, and the back half of it was the builder's yard and workshops. But he'd died by this time, and Della ran the post office with her husband Billy Smith, and the other side was the pub. My grandmother didn't think much of pubs. She was quite a
drink
god
doesn't feature much in your family history, which is unusual for those times.
Well, it is, because the cousins would play darts and what have you. And they were all sorts of football teams associated with pubs and darts teams associated with pubs. But my grandmother was very much not a religious fanatic. That's not true. She was a woman who had certain values, and she'd been brought up and she stuck to them, as did my mother. And she had a definite belief in Christianity. She always went to church. She didn't push it down anybody's throat, but that was her belief. And she had the idea, a bit like Nancy, the other grandmother, Nancy Whybro, that you did what you could for people, and action spoke louder than words.
Practical religion.
She was very much a practical woman, in that you did unto people what you'd wish they'd do unto you.
Not a bad maxim to live by, is it?
No, and in that case, that's how we ended up. She ended up with her son, Leslie, because she took him in at the age of 10 days, an illegitimate child, and how we ended up with John Chaplin living with us for 40 years. So
I think we spoke of.
Yes, we've spoken about that. So, yeah, it was, it was the way they were. So, but drink didn't figure very much. Made homemade wine, elderberry wine in particular, because it tastes almost like port if you make it properly. If it's good stuff, if you make it properly, it's fruitier than port, but it's a good substitute. And parsnip, which is pretty strong.
Slow gin.
Yeah. Well, they didn't go in much for strong spirit. They'd drink a bit of wine, but they didn't. You had brandy in the house for medicinal purposes. And let's face it, most of the things where people rush their kids to A&E or walking centres nowadays, we treated at home.
Olive oil for the ears.
olive oil for the ears, calamine for anything rashy.
Yeah.
Little oatmeal in and I used this on my daughter when she had chickenpox. Oatmeal in little muslin bags, soaked in water, or put in the bath. And if you've got something like chickenpox, I used to dab it on Alice, on the actual spots, and basically she hasn't got a single scar. It sort of dries it up. You leave it to dry, or it's you put it in the bath water and it's and it actually works. So the things that people worry about nowadays, we treated at home. Although I must say that my brother was back to TB. After the war, there were several major incidents that they tried to bring TB under control, and then we had outbreaks of polio. The outbreaks of polio were in the 50s. I remember lining up outside the Keene Hall for injections. God, we were frightened. But people were dying. There were all sorts of things going on. But the TB thing that frightened our family was that when they did the test on Leslie, it came up positive. And they took him up to Broomfield to check him, but they couldn't find anything wrong with him.
Yeah.
They said what must have happened was he'd been with somebody, or he'd caught it when it's gone. His immune system had picked it up and rejected it, if you like. And years later, Nigel Cottam, who used to sit next to him, and now he's in touch with him on Facebook, told him that he'd spent a long time in the sanatorium along with his mother with TB. And as Les said, "Oi, you're the one that probably made me get a positive reaction to TB because, Anyway.
We mentioned drink a moment ago. With all of the orchards in and around Galleywood, I've never heard mention of cider. Now,
No, they didn't
wouldn't have
make
been cider
cider.
apples. Did anyone
They
ever?
didn't grow cider apples.
They
grew.
never tried to make it out of
No,
the
not to
apples
my
that were there?
knowledge. I mean, we used to make crab apple jelly,
Yes.
but you need a special sort of apple to
You
make
do.
cider. It has to have quite a high tannin content, I think.
But you
It has to
think
be
with all
quite
the
acidic.
varieties, we might.
Yeah, just a fascination.
It wasn't.
We didn't.
It wasn't a. Although I noticed that Laithcoats are bringing out cider now.
They are, yes.
So
But that's
I'm
a
not
more
sure about.
modern-
I don't know where they've got their
version.
apples from because
Or-
perhaps they planted them.
Yeah, or mixed with them some imported ones for that purpose, perhaps.
Yes, I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know because you need stills and also. I don't know what you need. You need certainly things to mash it.
You mash and
You need it and
yeah.
brew it, don't you? And then
Yeah.
strain it and then ferment it somehow. I'm not sure. No, apart from a bit homemade wine, Although there was a brewery in Baddow, of course,
Yes.
and all the pubs had beer.
Yeah.
But cider didn't seem to be drunk very much. That's really-
Is there anything else on the? We started out saying
With the
we were talking
Whybros.
number. Anything else on the Whybros or?
Well, the most of them are buried in Galleywood churchyard.
Mm-hmm.
There's no one called Whybro living in the village now. They've all gone.
So they've come.
Les
they've
lives
been
in
a
Broomfield.
Significant part of the history.
But this is what happens. My
but
two
now
cousins
they're
who've got the Whybro name, one lives in Basingstoke, one lives in Wrexham. Christopher lives in Broomfield. Leslie lives in Broomfield. You see, what happened after the compulsory purchase of the fields is they filled them with people who need housing after the Second World War. And then the next phase of building was private building, and they were far too expensive. Ordinary people couldn't afford the paddocks
No.
or Chaplin's Close.
Yeah.
So basically, ordinary people pushed out. So if you hadn't got a council house, or you didn't have a really good job, you didn't stand a chance of living back in the village. I mean, it's happened all over the place. Oh, I mean, especially down in the West Country, hasn't it?
But of course, most of the, I'll call it the indigenous Galleywood, or the people that were living there, as you said, were tied up with the land And you know, we all know that's not the best paid job in the world.
It's a very strange situation that's happened now, because I think a lot of us are the grandchildren, if not the children, of farm labourers, although a lot of people wouldn't accept that they came from such roots for some obscure reason. But it's changed the way people live. They can't live in their own communities. Very many of us have been educated to the point where we have the ability to live anywhere we like. So that if you have a degree or teacher training or what have you, and I can see that's happened to the farmers locally, what they've done is their children have been educated to the nth degree, and when that's happened, they don't want to farm.
No.
Who wants to get up at 4:30 in the morning? They don't want to, so they've got jobs in London, in the city, or here, there and everywhere, doing other things.
Well, and the
numbers. The farms, houses get sold off, the land is amalgamated with other people, other pieces of land, and is farmed by people who are hedge fund managers and are not actually living anywhere near it, but they've bought up land because it's a good investment, gone up 17%.
Well, even the family farmers. I mean, Parklands would be an obvious example.
Parklands is one of the few.
The number of people they
Margaret
employ.
and Hall isn't.
It's minimal.
Lodge Farm isn't. They've all gone.
Yeah.
If they've not been built on, because let's face it, we've become a suburb of London, Chelmsford especially. They might call themselves a city, but actually they're just a London borough, in my opinion. And that's how. Well, it's just like, you know, Chelmsford's just Westfield number 3, isn't it? It's not got a historic heart to it. You ask Les about how historic it was working for Marconi's, Cromptons or Hoffmans. The people who actually worked in those so-called historic industries, they were if they lived 2 years after their 65th birthday retirement, that was unusual. They came out of Hoffman's stinking of engine oil and were dead within 2 years. Worked to death. No health and safety. I think the history of Chelmsford is industrial, and I think the history of Chelmsford as a city is just laughable. It hasn't got one. It hasn't got a history.
We must only leave that as a thought for those in 100 years' time, when the city is in its 100th birthday, and see
I know what happens in Colchester when they build anything here.
Yeah.
They hit archaeology. You go into Chelmsford. What major archaeological digs have ever been in Chelmsford? Not one.
But you won't find any.
Molsham, they found a bit of a Mancio.
Yeah.
Not even in Chelmsford. It's on the hill in Molsham.
We'll
but that is another matter.
We'll draw the recording to a close here, if we may. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.